Hello, everyone. You are listening to the latest Flyers Talk podcast. I am Jordan Hall, and as always, I am joined by the dynamic Joe Fordyce. Joe, I think it's safe to say the Flyers front office brass is without a doubt watching the playoffs, keeping a close eye on things, maybe learning a few things and trying to apply it to their team next season. So, with the playoffs really in full swing here, some series still needing to be wrapped up in the first round, we're going to look at some areas that where maybe the Flyers can learn a few things in these Stanley Cup playoffs. So, Joe, as you've been watching here, what's one thing that's really stood out to you in these playoffs and something the Flyers probably maybe can do next year?
Well, the next season part might be a little difficult because cap situation and those sort of things. But I think what you're learning is that the star players and we've heard the front office and John Tortorella several times reference they need more scoring and they need you need star players, you need snipers. And then when you look at the playoffs and the teams that are having success, those are the players that are stepping up. And you're seeing Artemi Panarin have a big series. You're seeing Mika Zibanejad have a big series for the Rangers. For Colorado, it's McKinnon and Makar, and the names that you expect are the names that score. And the issue is the Flyers are up against the cap, and I don't think they currently have any of those guys. And if they did, it would be Konechny and Tippett would be the guys that come to mind. And the problem with those guys is they go in stretches where they don't score for 4 and 5 games. And you don't really get that from these type of players. They're kind of up on another level. And also when you look at Vancouver's a team that they were a top seed, favored to win their series by, pretty heavily. And they're struggling a little bit going into now. They ran into Nashville as one of the hottest teams, but I don't think it's a coincidence that their top offensive player, or one of them, Elias Pettersson, he's really been, I don't want to say a no-show, but he's really struggled in the series. I think he has 2 points. So, and where are they? They're heading to a game 6 on the road when they were up in the series with a chance to close it out. They've, of course, had goaltending issues too, but I don't think it's a coincidence that when your top guys aren't producing, and you do have one of those guys, then your team struggles. And the challenge for the Flyers is being able to get one of those guys. Now, they might have one over in Russia. The problem is, I don't think he's going to be here next year. And it's a lot to bring a kid over whenever he comes over and say, you're this guy for us, and we need you to be this guy right away. That's a lot. He's got a lot of accolades, so he could be that guy. I'm not saying he can't be that guy. I'm saying it's a lot of pressure to bring a kid over and say, you need to be this guy, and you need to be there right away. So I think the Flyers are a little ways off unless they can get really creative. And plus, we talked about this on this podcast before. Those kind of players don't really become available that much. Like you see Steven Stamkos, maybe he's available, maybe he's not, but he's also 34. And I think most would argue his prime is in the rear view. So that's not like something the Flyers are looking for. But snipers, goal scorers, star players in their prime are not guys that really become available. So I feel like that is a big challenge for a team in a rebuild like the Flyers.
It really goes back to the debate of tanking versus rebuilding. And I think it's a fair debate. There's people that think the Flyers should have tanked a little bit more and really truly bottomed out to try to get a top 1, 2, 3 pick. But
you mean this coming draft?
Not this draft, but maybe in, whether it be past drafts or this draft.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing is, like, a lot of people are saying Mishkov could be sort of on the Bedard level.
Yeah.
We don't know. And that his home situation is the reason, we've gone through that about him. So that could be the case.
Yeah.
But I'm going to go back to what John Tortorella said. And I don't think it's a mystery to anybody that has John Tortorella as the head coach of this team, that if you're talking about tanking and these sort of things, you have the wrong coach there. He knows it. They know it. So I don't think that was ever in the plans.
No, and it wasn't. I think but when you see superstars really come to the forefront in the playoffs, you see McDavids, you see the McKinnons, the McCarrs, the Kachucks, the list goes on, and they
I
are
mean,
just
and the Rangers
yeah,
paid a huge amount to get to Artemi Panarin
right,
from, a team that was kind of he didn't want to be there anymore.
right,
So I don't know if I want to say they were fortunate to pay him $12 million a year, but
right,
they were fortunate in the sense that he wanted out and they had a team that was going this way
yeah,
quickly. So, that, but that's the rare case. A guy
mhm,
like Panarin in his prime is not generally available every offseason.
right, and yeah, and you see these superstars in the playoffs, and I think people would debate with like the Flyers have an all-star in Travis Konecny, but is he a superstar? Do you need a superstar to win the Stanley Cup to go on these deep runs, or can you find a team with a little more balance, some stars, but maybe not superstars? I think I think you can rebuild without needing to bottom out and to pick in the top 3. I think you can find these really elite players in the top 10 or 15 of the draft, and you can eventually strategically go out and get them in free agency or via trade. But um, I think there will be a ton of pressure absolutely on Matvei Mishkov, and will he be a star? The Flyers have already lost a fifth overall pick in Cutter Gauthier, and people will probably debate whether he's going to be a superstar or not. He'll probably be a very good player. Um, but yeah, the Flyers, I think, will have to, one, hope Mishkov really pans out, and also eventually try to find a way to help him, to supplement around him. And but I think it's fair if Flyers fans are watching the playoffs and saying we don't have one of these players, and is that problematic for the future? I think it's a fair argument.
It is, and you're just looking around the league and you're thinking back to previous Stanley Cup winners, recent ones. You can't really think of who's the team that's won without a guy or two guys,
Yeah.
or that you can point to and go, those are our guys. I'm not saying the Flyers don't have guys they can say that about right now, but I don't know that those guys that the Flyers point to are guys that can put you over the top. We kind of know what they are.
Hmm.
So, you don't, I mean, Colorado won the cup. We know who they have. Tampa Bay won the cup, and look at who they have.
Hmm.
It's, I don't think it's a mystery. Generally, these teams are built up with 1 to 2 forwards, generally a center and a winger that are just flat out snipers,
Hmm.
and a defenseman from the point who's one of the top defensemen in the league.
Yeah.
I mean, Tampa, just using the example, they won back-to-back cups. You have Stamkos and Kucherov with Victor Hedman at the point. Colorado, you have McKinnon, you have Rantanen, and they've filled in pieces nicely around them, and then you have Makar at the point. Like, it's not a mystery. The formula is there. It's just hard to get that formula on your team if you don't have it, particularly in a case where the Flyers are, where there's some money tied up in guys that could be buyout candidates and those sort of things. And, that stuff lingers,
Hmm.
and there's no quick fix to it. And, you look at it, even a team like Carolina, it's not like they're overrun with superstars, but their top players produce in the playoffs.
Hmm.
And even if they're not superstars, they're borderline superstars. I think anyone would argue the forward group for Carolina is superior to what the Flyers have at this point.
You even look at the Lightning, they had 3 40-goal scorers this year, and they got totally outclassed by the Panthers. I mean, Travis Konecny was the Flyers' leading scorer this year at 68 points, 33 goals. It's nothing to scoff at, but you really see some of these elite teams, and they are just littered with high-end talent guys that are putting up 100+ points and 40+ goals. I like the Flyers' ingredients. I think they have a lot of good things going with some of their young forwards, some young defensemen. I think we all know the picture in net, but perhaps it is a sign just watching these playoffs that they are far away. They still have some ways to go to not just make the playoffs, but really to be a true contender year in and year out. The teams that are contenders year in and year out have some stars up front, some superstars, I should say, up front.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at, so Florida's an example of a team that was able to do it on the trade and free agent route. Now, many would argue that Calgary trade that got Matthew Tkachuk to Florida, probably one of the worst trades in the last 5-6 years in the NHL. So Matthew Tkachuk's there, and I think many would argue he's a superstar. And then they get Sam Reinhart, who had a career year. I mean, of course, Flyer fans, Sam Reinhart, no matter what jersey he's wearing, always looks like a superstar against the Flyers. But he took the next step, and I don't know if he took the next step because he's with Tkachuk or whatever the reason was, or maybe they got him as he was going this way. I don't think people would argue that Sam Reinhart is a superstar. But maybe his level of play goes up based on who he's playing around. You know, if you can get creative and find ways, and let's be honest, luck is a little bit of a thing here. I mean, the idea that Calgary wanted to trade Matthew Tkachuk, he didn't want to be there anymore. But Florida, you know, they gave Jonathan Huberdeau was one of their top players for the previous 3-4 seasons. It's not like they gave up nothing, but they made a trade, a strategic trade that they like, and it's really worked out for them. They got Sam Reinhart, a player who has shown the ability to produce, and maybe, you know, he was producing in Buffalo and he didn't have much around him. He comes to Florida, pair him up with some guys that can play, and all of a sudden you're getting the best from him. So you can get creative. I don't think that's the common way to go about this, because you look around the league, they're really the only team that's gone to the next level via trades and free agency. Because even the Rangers, you know, Zibanejad's not one of their draft picks and Panarin isn't, but they got Fox, they got Zach Jones, the guys that a lot of their guys that make up the core of their team are players that they've developed and that they drafted. So it's a mixture. So the Flyers, they all admitted they still have work to do, and they do have work to do because they don't have a lot of cap space, and players that put you up to the next level aren't just hanging around, and teams aren't just willing to part with them all the time.
Celebrity cook Steve Martirano brings his Italian-American cooking back home to Philly. Enjoy Martirano's Prime at Rivers Casino and Steve's famous meatballs with Sunday gravy, prime steaks, and more. Make reservations for Martirano's Prime on Open Table. Joe, another thing I've really noticed watching the playoffs, and I think you see it every year in the playoffs, is just how tough it is to score, how tight checking it is. I think you see 1 second a player may have some space, and then suddenly he's being stick checked or body checked, and that play's being killed and it's going the other way. And that was one thing John Tortorella admitted at his exit interview, is that the Flyers developed a lot more transition offense this year, and that was a positive. But when it got down to the nitty-gritty of the regular season, he felt like he didn't help the Flyers try to develop more offense in the offensive zone. And perhaps that's a talent deficiency a little bit. Perhaps it's a little bit of coaching and not trying to adjust to styles when you need to. But that's one thing we've seen in the playoffs. The teams that are able to advance, they find a way to develop offense in the offensive zone in tight spaces. And the Flyers just didn't do that down the stretch. They did not. That 8-game losing streak, they could not score, and they were giving up goals at an alarming clip, and it produced a really ugly losing streak. Is that something you've noticed in these playoffs? Is that, you have to find ways to score in the offensive zone, and you need talent to do it too.
Yeah, when you look around the landscape of the playoffs, how many games have you seen that are going into the third period 0-0?
Yeah.
Toronto and Boston, for example. Look at the names on those teams. Now, I know Toronto has had guys, Matthews with the concussion syndromes, Nylander missed a couple games at the beginning of the series, but it's not like there's not other guys there that produce offense. And look at Boston. I mean, Jim Montgomery came out and called out David Pastrnak by name.
Yeah.
I mean, if Pastrnak is struggling to score in the playoffs, how much of a struggle would it be for the guys that the Flyers have to score if they were in the playoffs? So it is. And the other thing is, we saw the Flyers plagued by missing nets and not taking advantage of opportunities. And these guys in the playoffs that aren't scoring are guys that take advantage of almost every opportunity they have, and they're struggling. So it is a different game. John Tortorella preached that message near the end of the season that a lot of the guys on this Flyers team needed to get into those kind of games and see what it was like, because it's ratcheted up a level, the toughness. The goaltending gets better. The defense gets better. Like you mentioned, there's a little window and it gets closed up like that. And, I think part of it is absolutely a talent deficiency, like you said. And I don't think the good thing is I don't think the Flyers have made any bones about the talent deficiency. They've all acknowledged it. Nobody's tried to sugarcoat any of that. And the other thing is, I mean, you need to adjust. You just can't keep playing the same way if it's not generating scoring opportunities. And like you said, we saw in that losing streak, it just wasn't happening. It wasn't happening against good competition. It wasn't happening against the worst competition in the league. So there was clearly an issue there that went beyond just the talent. So I think that's another thing that needs to be worked on. And I do think there is a lot you can learn by watching some of these teams that zip the puck around, particularly on the power play. And a lot of it is talent, but some of it is not talent. Some of it is creativity, and the pieces are sort of interchangeable. If you look at it and make the pieces interchangeable, you can learn some stuff from it. Of course, it's going to come down to talent, because we see the guys that score on these teams that have the top power plays, and they're not nobodies. They're not third line and fourth line players generally. So it's talent, but it's also scheme. I think it's absolutely scheme, and I think we saw that late in the season for the Flyers.
Yeah, for sure. And it'll be interesting just to see what the next step is for the Flyers, not just from a wins-loss playoff standpoint, but Tortorella talked about year one, it was all about defensive principles and playing better in front of the goalie. Year two, this season for the Flyers, more developing some transition offense, taking more risks. So what will be next? Obviously, they struggled down the stretch to find a style that worked for them. They struggled to adjust to the style of play at that time of year. So I wonder what Tortorella and company will think is next for the Flyers. And Travis Konecny is an all-star player. He's a very good player. I think people want to see him get into contract extension even before he goes into a contract year, but he needs help. And it's not really bashing some of the players the Flyers have now. It's more just like, yeah, they're going to need help eventually. If they want to take that real big next step into consistent contender, they're going to need help. They're going to need more talent. And how they do it is a big question. It's going to be Dana Briere having to get creative. They're drafting and developing, making sure they're hitting on picks that they have.
I think player
they've got
development is a
first-round picks.
huge deal.
Yeah.
And, you see the guys they've brought into this organization, it's, even down to John LeClaire and Patrick Sharp. And these are guys that had successful careers. They know what good hockey looks like. And to maximize talent of players that need to be, you need guys like that around to get the most out of certain guys. So I think that they've done the right things. I just think at the steps leading up to this, to where they are right now, I think are probably a little easier than what the next few steps are, because the next few steps are there's barriers that are not really as movable, let's say. One of them being the salary cap, and having players that can come in and produce immediately. You can't just snap your fingers and say, all right, Travis Konecny, you scored 33. We need 43 from you next year, or we need whatever it is. There's more that goes into it than just telling a guy you need more. All these guys want to do more. There's a lot of components that go into that. So I feel like these next few steps that they're on are going to be maybe the biggest challenges of this rebuild, are what the next few things are to come.
Yeah, we really thought, especially last summer, it was kind of like the honeymoon phase for, Briere, Jones, and company, because people are excited, that the work hasn't quite started yet, and they had a great offseason. They backed up their word of trying to rebuild. They implemented more youth this year, and I think people were starting to buy in, but really the tougher decisions are ahead, as you mentioned, getting it to the next level, facing some adversity, trying to get into the playoffs, and then also become a real threat in the playoffs. And Joe, one thing that will continue to rear its ugly head until it's fixed is the power play. That's one thing in the playoffs that always stands out to me. You cannot have a dead last power play and expect to be serious in the playoffs. The Flyers will eventually have to somehow find a way to have a better power play, to be a real dangerous team come spring. You just don't see teams in the bottom 5 or even dead last like the Flyers were in the power play to be a serious contender.
No, that unit absolutely has to click in
Yeah.
order to take the next step as a team. Um, you look around the playoffs and the landscape of the playoffs, and there's nobody there where you're like, man, their power play. Now, I will say this: Boston's power play, despite the names, struggled for the whole season.
Mhm.
But because of the names, you fear their power play.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody feared the Flyers' power play for most of this season.
Mhm.
I mean, they were going between 10 and 12% for a lot of the season. That's not, I mean, I know in fact here doing the games, we would always say like, can we can we decline the power play?
Yeah, go on the penalty kill
Right,
instead.
exactly. Um,
Yeah.
so you can't have that. That has to get better. And one of the only ways to, you would see they would lose some games and they'd be 0 for 4 on the power play, 0 for
Yeah.
5 on the power play. If teams are giving you opportunities, you can't let them pass by. And that's both individual opportunities as well as team opportunities like a power play. You know, the teams that rise to the top don't have struggles like that.
Yeah.
And that, excuse me, they acknowledged it. Again, they're not making any bones about it.
Yeah.
There was a big discussion about that during the post-game media availabilities that power play is something that really has to be a focus. So I think they will. I think they'll focus on it coaching wise and where available, when available, personnel wise. So
Yeah, it kinda all leads back to talent too, right?
yeah, I mean, look at the
Just
teams that have the best power plays.
superstars.
Edmonton,
Yep, exactly.
superstar power play. Tampa Bay, superstar power play. And you mentioned they got completely outclassed in their series.
Yeah.
Dallas. I mean, these guys have players all over the place. You're like, to me, the key to a power play, and Boston may be the outlier on this, but when you look at a team's power play, you're like, here comes its power play with X, Y, and Z, and you can immediately rattle the names of the power play off.
Yeah.
Boston was like that when Bergeron was there. Now it's kind of like Pasternak, and you're like, how does a power play with him struggle? But you look at power plays like the Rangers and Dallas and Florida, and it's like, they have this 40-goal scorer. Even a team like Winnipeg, who struggled to score goals for most of the year and were a defensive-oriented team, when they went on a power play, it was like, well, they have Scheifele and Kyle Connors, a 40-goal scorer in the past. Like, you immediately identify who are the biggest threats on this power play.
Mhm.
I don't think the Flyers have a biggest threat on that power play than what we saw
Yeah.
this past season.
Indeed, and I think the power play naturally will get better whenever they take that next step because they will probably want to go out and get more talent externally. So talent, I think, will help it no matter what, but I agreed with John Tortorella this year at his exit interview. He said, "Listen, we do have some talent. We have enough talent here that it shouldn't be that bad." They do. They do have some pieces that, yeah, without a doubt, it's probably some X's and O's and coaching, and it can't just be. You can't just pin it all on personnel. They had some players that they think can be power play producers down the line. So
Yeah, and I
it's a little
mean,
bit of
we've
everything.
seen the ability from a guy like Owen Tippett. His coach even said it. If he hits the net, he has 7, 10 more goals.
Yeah,
We know that's there, the ability to do so. It's just there is a consistency component that is missing with some of the top players on this Flyers roster currently.
mhm,
And I think that's going to be a big focus this offseason is get more consistent,
yeah,
take advantage of opportunities. And these are, I know Konechny's a veteran player, but I think a lot of us forget because Tippett has been more than we expected when they got him in the trade for Giroux. He's a young player,
yeah.
and these guys get better, and they're driven to get better. That's the other thing. So, it's a young team, and I think it's going to get younger before it gets older.
Yeah.
So I think that's all part of it. It's all part of coaching. It's all part of player development, is taking advantage of opportunities and becoming a consistent player that can be relied on night after night, so that when you look at the lineup sheet, it's not a different night. There's not a lot of the amount of question marks, and you're wondering about who's playing, and you want that to dwindle.
Mm-hmm.
You want it to be a night by night. We can assume who's playing with who. This guy's on the first line. These guys are on the second line, that kind of thing. And it's just not at that spot with the Flyers right now. And a lot of that has to do with consistency, and obviously talent, which we've talked about a lot.
A ton. And throughout this season, for a while, we were thinking, wow, this rebuild might be a little bit expedited, but you're seeing now that
Yeah, I think the playoffs really accentuate something. And Brooke and I were talking about it the other day when I saw Brooke. We were talking about how these playoffs make you pump the brakes a little bit, where it's like, yeah, the Flyers were close to the playoffs, but look at and I'm not saying Washington. I think the Flyers were right there with Washington, but look what happened to Washington in the playoffs.
Gosh, just got worked.
Yeah. I mean, so if you're going to go by the team that the Flyers finished closest to, or the two teams, Islanders, Capitals, look what happened to those two teams in the first round.
Yeah.
And what was the reason? Scoring.
Yeah.
They couldn't score.
Yeah.
And it's really weird to say that, a team that has Alex Ovechkin and John Carlson, but I don't think anybody expected the Capitals to make the playoffs this year.
Right.
So, but when you look at the majority of the Flyers, or the majority of the playoff teams, and then you compare them to the Flyers, it's a little bit eye-opening when you look at, okay, this team does have some more work to do. And I think that's more of a fan or an analyst or people that cover the team thing, like us. I don't think that there's any questions that the front office of this team sees that and realizes it and knew it already, in fact.
Yeah.
So,
no, and I think that's the best thing the Flyers have gone,
Yeah.
is that their decision makers, even their head coach, John Tortorella, who was uber competitive, even flat out admitted he didn't think they would do much in the playoffs, but it would have been a great experience. I think that tells you everything. I think that's a positive, Joe, without a doubt.
Absolutely.
Is
Because
that they
what you don't want is it to be eye-opening to the fans and the people that cover the team, but also eye-opening to the front office.
Yeah.
I think if you talk to Jonesy, Briere, Torts, which he even said, they would say, yeah, this is what it's the playoffs. This is what we would expect.
Yeah.
And they realize they're not there yet.
Yeah.
And they have work to do.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think the next few steps are going to be very telling about where this team is headed.
Absolutely. And we will definitely talk a lot about it, Joe, on Flyers Talk podcast. We'll have a ton of them throughout the summer, throughout the offseason. We'll be watching the playoffs closely and continue to really dissect all these big questions facing the Flyers after this rebuilding season that fell just short of the playoffs. Joe, thank you so much. Great to see you. Great to chat with you, as always. A big thank you to Ben Berry, our podcast producer and guru. And Flyers fans, as always, thank you so much for listening to the latest Flyers Talk podcast. Wherever you get your podcast, please rate and listen. And we cannot wait to talk to you next time.